Since the dawn of the fantasy age, the wizard has held supremacy. With their control over magic, the elements, and the weave of the world around them, spellcasters wreak havoc on the battlefield and at court. But today, we rise up, we reclaim that power, and we learn how to destroy a wizard. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle. I am the Dork. Welcome to Desks and Dorks. We make indie role-playing game content, usually with a historical bent. This video is brought to you by you. You all smashed the like goal for the last video, where I talked at length about how to win a low fantasy war from a tactical perspective, and today I get to tell you how we vanquish the arcane. A few things before we get started. If you would like to support us, you can join our Patreon, where you can get unique games that you can't buy anywhere else once a month. And in an added twist, the horrors of the world have risen up around us, and you can have a spooky good time because our PDFs, the digital version of A Fear Within, our newest horror role-playing game, are officially live over at our itch.io page. If you are interested in a game that casts you and your friends as pairs of kids and the monsters based on the fears that they have, fighting against a greater evil, a game inspired by things like Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark, scary stories to tell in the dark. If you like any of that stuff, then you are going to love this game. And finally, it is being shipped to backers, which means I can give you the digital version today. So I love that. And again, thank you to everybody who helped us get here. Without further ado, what are we going to discuss? We are going to cover how medieval warfare and warfare in antiquity would function, but how it might function in response to the presence of magic and magic users. Those people are going to disrupt tactics in a very, very big way. We're going to apply what we know about medieval and ancient warfare, and we're going to use that knowledge and that understanding and talk about how we would use it to defeat foes who in many cases can manipulate the elements around them and in fact change the world at the snap of a finger, right? We are also going to cover it in ways that we can implement it into our games. Remember, this is a tabletop channel in addition to being a history channel, and I feel like I can add a little bit of extra sauce to this. I was trained to be a medievalist. I have a medieval history degree. Now, one more important thing though, we are going to be engaging in a type of historical study called speculative history, because as we all know, wizards weren't real, right? But we can apply a lot of the lessons that we learn in real life history and weapons development and how they might apply to the wizard. One final thing, however, battle in general, but battle particularly when you have somebody who can treat the Geneva Convention like a Geneva checklist with, the blink of an eye, means that it comes with a lot of gruesomeness. Battle always comes with a lot of gruesomeness. I am not going to be covering a lot of that today because A, I don't think it's very useful, and B, I want to get into the logistics of how you might fight someone like that. If you are going to get into those gory details, as always, I would suggest that you use safety or communication tools, X cards, lines and veils, session zero, whatever. Just make sure that your players are doing all right and make sure everyone is having a good time at your table before you do anything else. And with that out of the way, let's talk about how to absolutely obliterate some wizards. But in order to do that, I have to set some ground rules for us on what a wizard is and how a wizard functions. If you'll allow me to get academic for a second, the idea of wizard, at least how we're going to be using it, is a catch-all term for a spellcaster. Historically, stuff like druids and witches, warlocks, whatever, they follow a lot of the same tropes. Don't believe me? When I tell you that there is a spellcaster who passes on set spells to an apprentice who learns in an academic setting over long periods of time and follows a tradition of spellcasting, you probably think of wizard. However, what I just described to you are first-hand accounts of real-world druids. Or if I am to describe a spellcaster who sets up an arcane ritual that if you violate the principles of that ritual, either the way that it is set up or the materials used, there are consequences ranging from the spell fails to actual bodily dismemberment, you might be thinking, oh, that's a powerful wizard spell. I have actually just laid out how a witch's ritual works, or a witchual, if you will. Again, I know that these are different terms for different spellcasting classes and archetypes in popular role-playing games, right? Things like D&D or Shadow of the Demon Lord. all of those things, or even Die, by the way, which is a phenomenal RPG, all have classes based on the spellcasting archetypes, and they're all called different things. But historically, the idea of wizardry is essentially one that goes across cultural lines and definitions in ways that have later been twisted and turned into other stuff. So depending on the world and your game, there's going to be differences, but historically speaking, I'm telling you right now, wizard is pretty useful as a catch-all term. That has to be established right out of the way. And two, we really have to talk about the ground rules for magic and wizardry. Remember, we are still firmly in the low fantasy setting, which means that although wizards are capable of incredible power and massive might, there are limitations to their abilities and to their functions that we can exploit on the battlefield. So the first limitation is that being a wizard isn't for everyone. If it was, it wouldn't be a low fantasy world anymore. It's far more likely you'd have, high fantasy wizards rolling around. In a low fantasy world, you're going to deal with far more chosen ones. So, for example, people who are rare, blessed, whether it's by the gods or the dark forces, dragons, or, I don't know, Jeff from down the street who just dubs you a wizard and then all of a sudden you are. However your world building works, the chosen one is very common in a low fantasy setting because magic isn't for everybody. In some low fantasy settings, you have individuals who are talented, groups of talented people. They might hail from a certain region, a certain cultural group, or in some cases might be born under a certain sign, but they generally tend to be exceptions to the rule rather than the rule themselves. And some people might attain arcane power through sheer force of will. This is arguably one of the best ways to justify the reign of magic in a low fantasy world, I think, because again, if anybody can set up, like a witch-like ritual for the darker powers in order to gain access to magic, maybe people know that, but they aren't willing to deal with the cultural stigma, the social sacrifice, or the fear in order to gain those powers. Only those with either the greatest ambition or the strongest iron will would be willing to take part in that. And again, I like this because even in our real world, there are people with great will who would go on to achieve amazing things. Like, think of mega marathon runners or ninja warrior athletes or, professional skydivers. These are individuals who, yes, have talent, but also the will to take on extreme things. Not everybody is going to be willing to or able to take on the hard work and practice, the danger to themselves that magic, or in our case, like in the real world, extreme activities often presents. And so I like this as well. Either way, whether through chosen ones, a certain group, or just the sheer force of will and discipline necessary, magicians, wizards, as you will, are going to be far more limited and only occupy a small part of the populace. Now, learning magic takes time. This is another important distinction that we have to make into account now, because it's going to matter later on when we get to the battlefield. You can use some power of arcane ability even if you're one of those lucky few, but harnessing that into far more powerful abilities takes time, training, and effort, usually under the tutelage of a far more experienced spellcaster. In some worlds and in some world building, this is taken the place of by things like experience, right? Maybe you're born with an inkling of power, and it's through the constant application of its power through dangerous situations that you grow in experience and understanding of the variabilities that you're trying to harness. But either way, whether through teaching or raw experience, becoming a talented wizard, one who would find themselves on the battlefield, has to take time and energy in order to get there. This makes sense, right? In many cases, there are allusions to wizardry as an academic practice, an academic path, as opposed to just the path of simple power. As any academic will tell you, and I know this from experience, gaining clout, quote unquote, for lack of a better term, in academic circles takes a massive amount of time and a ton of peer review. Although in our wizard's case, peer review will come on the battlefield rather than in the library or the lecture hall. But either way, becoming a wizard in a low fantasy world must take time. Wizards are also still mortal-ish. So a wizard might be able to enhance aspects of themselves, weapons, or in some cases physical traits through the use of their arcane ability. They may gain greater senses or greater understanding. They may be able to bolster their lifespan or render themselves immune to things like disease or poison or aging. But specifically, there are still going to be mortal weaknesses. They'll probably still need to eat and sleep. They will probably still need to take care of themselves. And even if they're able to, say, I don't know, remove the fear of disease from their lives, they probably won't be able to do that and remove the need to eat and the need to sleep and a weakness to poison. They probably won't be able to do all of those things. A wizard is still mortal. They are still human-ish, and I say mortal because you could have maybe elves or dwarves in your low fantasy world. Although, again, low fantasy worlds generally don't have a ton of fantasy races, but you might have, one or two floating around somewhere. So mortal is important. They can still be slain. They can still be taken out. And they still need the basic functions of physiology that you or I do right now. And also, magic has to have implicit rules of some kind. I call this the lightsaber theory, because if you've ever watched Star Wars, you can run around with a lightsaber and they act like it has weight, even though it's light on a handle. You could wave it around like a flashlight and just eviscerate people, but they act like it still has weight. This is kind of an implicit rule of that setting's magic, quote unquote, and just like that, wizards in this world will have magic. Now, this could be, for example, that magic takes time to complete, a long-standing ritual type of magic, or it could be that magic has some sort of implicit cost, either in terms of what it takes from the spellcaster or what it takes from the world around it. I have included a picture of Frieren from Frieren Beyond Journey's End because this setting, although it is high fantasy, has a really interesting concept of magic. The idea is that magic is as personal and unique as the person wielding it, and that magic is entirely limited by the imagination of the person. If you have enough power and you can imagine it happening, there is a potential that you can do it. Again, this is a good example of magic in a high fantasy setting, but it's another example of using rules as an implicit way to balance out magic. And in low fantasy, that is common. And finally, magic carries with it a cost. I'm going to put on the conjecture zone here for a second, because in every single role-playing game, there is some sort of abstraction that stops the player from just casting spells every single turn willy-nilly. It's basically an extrapolated version, a gamified version of the costs of the magic ritual in history, right? Because as you study witchcraft and wizardry throughout the ages, there are some commonalities. For example, the sacrifice of life in order to accomplish some sort of spell or ritual practice. This is fairly common across pretty much every culture and every geographic location on Earth. The greater the sacrifice in terms of what is being given, the greater the perceived benefit from the spell. That is an implicit sacrifice or an implicit cost. Specific ritual practices are also a type of cost. These are, in many cases, very time-consuming activities with exacting procedures that must be carried out to the very specific letter, lest you fall victim, essentially, to your own spellcraft. So it takes time, both in terms of setup, both in terms of the exacting nature, the understanding of that ritual, and in many cases, the material components necessary to accomplish those things, right? When we talk about material components in D&D, for example, that is, in many cases, an extrapolation and extension of this type of ritual magic. And in some cases, exhaustive training and knowledge is itself an implicit cost. The alchemist, historically, for example, is somebody who had to have years upon years of training just to make the kind of chicanery that could pass for legitimate spellcasting in European courts. And some of them actually just wound up becoming real-life chemists because they accidentally stumbled onto real-life elementary practices as a result of the amount of time and effort that it took to make that stuff happen. And when I say exhaustive training, I don't just mean you being tired because you're reading books. In many cases, you were exposing yourself to not just conditions, but materials that were toxic and harmful to the human body. Alchemists specifically worked with stuff like mercury that carried a very real cost on the mind and the health of the people working with it. And on top of all of that, some of the spell casting equipment, quote unquote, is incredibly expensive. I think you and I, as lay people, take for granted the use of glassware in the modern era, but glass for a very long time was rare and expensive. The same goes for porcelain, which would have been used for some of those alchemical receptacles. These are not just simple baubles or trinkets to have around. In many cases, they represent a massive amount of financial expense or time-consuming expertise in order to craft. In many ways, the magic systems of the world are extrapolations of that, and it gets darker. By the way, this is a picture of King Solomon. One of the things that is attributed to King Solomon is that he had magic abilities that allegedly came from demons. And depending on what reading you have, he may have sacrificed a little bit more than something physical in order to gain those abilities. But it's not just isolated to King Solomon. Ideas of the demonic as a form of pact for magical ability predate King Solomon even. So it's an important thing to realize that when I say it can get darker, I mean sometimes wizards had to sacrifice their souls in order to use or potentially use magical abilities. All of these things, however, are extrapolations of what would later become the limiting factors of magic in a game system, right? It's really hard to gamify the 2 weeks of time and the exorbitant cost of making porcelain in a setting. So we just use things like spell slots to sort of, not summarize, but as a sort of, summarize. Spell slots are in many ways a kind of summary, an amalgamation of all of the different sundry costs of spellcasting, all thrown into one. They're kind of an effective way of doing that. So, by the way, are concepts like the law of equivalent exchange. Fullmetal Alchemist, I think, does a great job of this. Yes, you are allowed to do crazy things in that world, but the crazier the thing you do, the crazier the cost you have to pay. It's a very simple system, but it really does get the wheels turning, and in many cases represents a real-life exchange of power in exchange for time, money, expertise, shattered relationships, and the loss of life and limb on the part of the wizard. However, mana and mana management is perhaps one of the greatest extrapolations of this. It's a really cool thing to take into account that these systems, like a mana pool or spell slots, the law of equivalent exchange, systems like this are again extensions of the difficulties associated with magic and the implicit cost that comes with wielding power beyond our world. All of these things matter, and we have to take it into account when we are discussing the wizard. But now we have to talk about what could be like a wizard in real life. Obviously, we're going to engage in speculative history right here because I can't in reality pick up a real life source, an anecdotal source, a primary source, and find evidence of wizardry on the battlefield. It's never going to happen. So what we have to do as historians and game masters is look at what could be a good comparison to a wizard. And to start with, let's summarize the things that are both strengths of a wizard and weaknesses of a wizard. A wizard would be incredibly powerful. The ability to manipulate reality even in a limited sense, or the elements even in a limited sense, is not something to discount in the middle of a military action. They are expensive, right? In terms of training and time, and they're hard to replace, but they're also really flexible. Again, because a wizard has access to powers and abilities that other people wouldn't potentially have, I think that goes a long way in helping them to be really good. And wizards would either be super flexible and have a range of different spells and abilities to help them out, but may not specialize in one thing, or I think would heavily specialize and be kind of like an arcane sledgehammer, applying, that one power to every single situation. As the old adage goes, when you have a big arcane hammer, everything starts to look like a pathetic arcane nail. And I started thinking about what could be parallels to these wizards. Expensive, incredibly powerful, hard to replace, but flexible or useful, at least in a range of either many situations or in one specific situation that they're just always going to be perfect for. And one of the best things for this are siege towers. Siege towers don't pop up often in either medieval or antiquity-based warfare, but when they pop up, they're just kind of like that wizard with the one really effective spell or incantation. They are usable all of the time. The siege towers depicted here are depictions of one of that belonged to one of Alexander's generals, the Diadochi. After his death, they would have used this to actually besiege stuff in Anatolia. They're incredibly effective and would have been great at destroying a number of different cities and fortifications. The issue with a siege tower like this, right, is that it's hard to transport, there's that inflexibility part, and it's incredibly expensive both to create initially and to maintain and transport. So again, this is a pretty good, interesting parallel when we're talking about the wizard. Experienced units are also a great parallel, a great one-to-one comparison point for the wizard, right? An elite cavalry unit with the best weapons and armor that money can buy, and 10 to 15 years of experience on the battlefield would have essentially been impossible to replace at medieval wartime. And in fact, this happens a couple times in the Middle Ages where a really experienced unit is completely wiped out or captured, and the impact that it has on the entire army is catastrophic in some cases, right? So a wizard with the immense amount of both time and energy, but also money poured into a wizard, and the experience, the power, the fear that they would strike into the enemy, all of that stuff that they would bring to bear makes them very similar to a heavily experienced, well-trained, well-armed, and expensively equipped unit of real soldiers. That's another great parallel. Cavalry, by the way, also gets a little bit of a nod here because of how flexible they were on the battlefield. You could use them as shock troops to try to break formations. You could use them to run down fleeing soldiers, but most of the time you would just use them to strike fear into massed groups of people, because good God, do you want to stand in the way of 500, 600, 800 pounds of steel, muscle, and sharp pointy bits charging towards you? I sure as heck don't. So again, they're flexible, they're expensive, they're hard to replace, and a heavily experienced unit is a great one-to-one parallel for the wizard. But then I started to think about this, and I don't think the best examples of this are in the medieval ages. I don't think they're in antiquity. I think the best examples are in modern battle, because if you think about how a wizard functions, in many cases they're kind of like fighter pilots from World War I, where they ignore the overall rules of warfare at the time. They don't need to be dug into those trenches because, again, they can soar above them. They can harry the enemy below with basic impunity, at least until anti-aircraft stuff was developed, or obviously it had already been developed but was put into place. And in a lot of cases, airplanes were used to take each other out so that they couldn't harass and harry and take care of ground-based or land-based troops and operations. In many ways, a duel between two airplane aces is kind of like a duel between two powerful wizards, with the winning wizard being able to essentially exercise its arcane ability on the enemy with impunity. I think that's kind of a useful parallel for us when we're thinking about the role of the wizard. Tanks, at least in tanks in some places where tank combat was very common, like World War II, for example, I think are another great example of the wizard. The Panzer tank, which was produced by the German forces during World War II, I think is especially a good stand-in for the wizard. These were incredibly powerful in upfront combat. However, they were exorbitantly expensive to manufacture and make. They were heavily fuel consumptive, which meant as resources got more and more scarce throughout the war, they were more difficult to deploy, in some cases having to be stranded. And despite their great power and destructive capabilities, they were constantly outnumbered by the far more efficiently produced Sherman tanks by the US forces on the Western Front. This is another good example of a wizard who, despite having all of the powers and abilities that would put them above the regular soldier, are, for the most part, still going to potentially be outnumbered and maybe even outclassed by a far easier group of soldiers to churn out, which are just really experienced traditional warriors. It's another great example, but perhaps the greatest example of this is the use of drone warfare in the modern era. By the way, Slava Ukraini, shout out to the Ukrainians. You guys are doing awesome. I hope you all are doing okay. It's been kind of an inspiration to watch as a person who grew up studying real life warfare, to watch a actual resilient group of people fight against fascist forces. Good for you guys. Honestly, it's sweet. But in any case, yeah, I think drone pilots and drone agents are a great example of what a wizard could be. These are quite literally individuals who are exercising a totally different skill set than the normal soldier, a skill set that lets them fight asymmetric war in a way that the rest of the combatants don't, whether that is through the gaining of intelligence systems, which, gosh, that sounds like spells like Unseen Servant, or in some cases carrying out actions like dropping ordnance or destroying defensives or destroying vehicles. Operation Spiderweb, which was a real operation that happened 5 weeks ago, where the Ukrainian military essentially was able to disable something like 70 or 80% of Russia's actual long-range ballistic air force using drones, is an incredible example of what an elite team of wizards could do to an unprepared country that still thinks it's fighting a traditional war. But we are not an unprepared power. We have the knowledge to beat the wizard. Everything that we have done up to now, I think, is essential, because understanding the enemy, understanding its parallels, understanding how it may function in a battlefield is essential to figuring out how to defeat them. And so what I've done for this section is I have actually split it up into sub-chapters based on how you could beat a wizard using different resources, depending on the nature of your organization and the low fantasy world that you occupy. All of these things could potentially work, and all of them are potentially useful, but they might not work for the situation, they might not work for the organization, and they might not work for the specific wizard. Let's start with something that I think a lot of folks are going to be unfamiliar with, and that's intelligence and soft power. You see, in a world where wizards are real, espionage and soft power stop being a leisure and become a necessity. This happens, by the way, in the real world. Whenever a side gains a technological advantage or a strategic advantage, every single effort shifts to figuring out how to replicate it or counter it. One of the greatest examples of this is how the West stole gunpowder from the Chinese. We realized fairly quickly that this was going to be a device, a weapon, a type of power that was going to change the face of the world and the face of warfare itself. And Western agents from a number of different European powers were essentially tasked with stealing or bringing home the secrets of gunpowder at any cost, by any means necessary. And it's not hard to see why, because once gunpowder does get to Europe and the arquebus is invented, it does wind up shifting the entirety of both Europe's trajectory as a continent, but Europe's trajectory as a military force in general, right? This is a great example, and if you have somebody that can essentially replicate the effects of gunpowder by waving their hands in a funny motion and doing Naruto hand signs, you better believe someone is going to figure out how to replicate that, or kidnap a bunch of wizards and get them to teach our people how to be wizards. It would 1000% happen. Another great example of this occurs during World War II, where spies infiltrated things like the Manhattan Project. That's a really important thing to have because you want to have access to the atomic bomb. It's a useful weapon that would change the face of warfare in a similar way that magic would change the face of low fantasy warfare. I didn't include a picture of it as well. By the way, these are spies from the Los Alamos Project, which is, the American scientific project that developed the atomic bomb, but also the codes and the secret to breaking stuff like the Enigma machine is another great example of the importance of intelligence and intelligence gathering. If you're going to wage war, information about wizards literally translates to power. You're going to want to know the wizard's weakness, what spells or incantations a wizard is capable of using, what family or friends or leverage you can gain on a wizard. No matter how powerful an arcane spellcaster is, if you have kidnapped their family, there's a very real chance you can get the powerful wizard to do something for you. And yes, you might be playing with fire, but if you're up against a force that you have no way to beat, if that wizard is in play, you're willing to take those kinds of risks. Intelligence gathering and espionage become effective weapons against a wizard or a war in general, because if they're going to wage asymmetric warfare, you as a group need to be willing to wage asymmetric warfare right back. But one of the things that I think people fighting against spellcasters are going to forget is the importance of diplomacy. In a world where wizards are real, they're kind of like weapons, or at the very least expensive weapons, things like fighter jets or Apache attack helicopters or tanks, right? They are essentially a tradable good, and the arms trade has existed for thousands of years, ever since one person got the advantage over another. It's entirely plausible, for example, that a country with a lot of wizards, or at least a couple really powerful wizards, may not necessarily need them in that moment. Consider a scenario where the country that has a bunch of wizards, or the army that has a bunch of really terrifying wizards, needs funds in order to carry on the rest of its campaign. Although it has these wizards, it still needs to feed its soldiers, or perhaps they're a long rogue army looking for its own home. When if you have a bunch of arable land that you can give them in exchange for those wizards teaching your wizards, that becomes a useful and effective trade. It's important to take into account that in many cases warfare, even in the Middle Ages and in antiquity, isn't just about the wholesale slaughter and fighting of other human beings. In many cases, warfare is a lever that a ruler pulls in order to get something they want. Diplomacy is a way to expedite that lever pulling so that both sides get a little something they want and no blood has to be shed. How much are you willing to give to potentially, instead of making an enemy, making an arcane friend? If the country is strapped for food, how much food are you, as a country, willing to give to gain access to those arcane abilities? Do they want money? Do they want weapons? Do they want medicine? All of these things are potential bargaining chips. Remember, warfare is a lever by which a ruling class tries to get what they want. So, why not, if you're outmatched magically, try to explore pulling a different lever, and potentially making allies that will pave the way for your future military success in the process. But let's say that soft power has failed. There's still several options, because if you remember correctly, not everyone can be a wizard. They're rare, they're important, they're vital to the process and hard to replace, whereas we have a never-ending horde, in some cases, of untrained peasant militias. The human wave strategy does exist throughout warfare. It was used during the Civil War. It was used during World War II, and honestly, it can be used quite effectively. Remember, a human wizard or a mortal wizard is only as useful as the number of spells that they can take in one day, and is only as capable as their senses will allow. If you throw 400 people at a single wizard, chances are you'll get them. Remember, the wizard can, obliterate or unalive 300 of the 400, but you only have to hit the wizard once. However, you're seeing pictures of the Panzer tank on your screen. I referenced them earlier, and there's a reason for that. You see, in World War II, the Panzer, a far more mechanically superior weapon, was often used to hold important points or protect choke points during a military campaign, kind of like how you would potentially use a wizard in a town or important choke point. And one of the most interesting things about overwhelming and obliterating through inferior but still useful and capable numbers is how the Sherman tank would take down the Panzer. There's two potentially different ways to do this, and I think they could actually work pretty well with the wizard. Our red squares in this instance are actually individuals, well-armored and adventurers or swordsmen, knights, whatever, and the black square or black rectangle is our wizard. You see, one of the techniques that Shermans would use is they would send a point platoon, or not platoon, but a point engagement party, essentially a group of Shermans in a spearhead formation that would draw the attention of the panzer and the fire of the panzer, while individuals outside of that, point group would attempt to flank the panzer and exploit either weaknesses in its treads or in the sides of its armor. In this way, the panzer could be overwhelmed and defeated with a minimal loss of tanks on the side of the Shermans, or in our case, with a minimal loss in the side of, the knights, the warriors, the individuals that we have hired or brought on in our army to deal with these wizards. Now, in this example, casualties still happened. They happened for the Shermans, by the way. It's estimated that 3 out of every 5 Shermans would not survive that encounter. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily work as a one-to-one correlation or translation for our battle against the arcane, but it does give us a good example or a good use on how we could potentially, through the use of overwhelming with slightly inferior soldiers, manage to defeat a far more superior unit. Remember, a wizard can still get distracted. They're still mortal. We can still take advantage of the weaknesses in their abilities, and drawing their attention while flanking them is a great example of doing so. The other one that you can do is to divide their focus. This is another way that you could do this. Instead of sending a point group first and then having the point group hold them while you have 2 parties flank, this case we would just split up into 3 separate groups, a group of 2, a group of 2, and a group of 1, and all would come at different directions all at the same time. Depending on the wizard's speed, if you have fast moving troops like knights, for example, this could be a great way to again overwhelm and divide the focus of the wizard in this situation. Something that comes up a lot when I coach, by the way, I coach professional video game players, which is kind of cool. It's like a side job that I do, is that sometimes you can panic when you're being what we call third-partied, which is when you're attacked from multiple sources at multiple teams. Even really talented individuals with great hand-eye coordination and reaction time can panic when they realize, oh my gosh, there is more for me to do in this one situation. And that sensory overload can actually trigger the brain and make it harder for that person to respond to any one of those individual parties. This is another potentially useful strategy that we can have and utilize in order to gain an advantage over the wizard. So again, focus on fast-moving, hard-hitting troops, and remember that with this method, you want to be able to afford those losses more than the wizard can. When would you attempt this? Well, if you have clear numerical superiority, or you must absolutely take a position, or you have expendable troops that you're not worried about. Again, this method works if you have either a ton of folks or a lot of fast-moving folks that you don't care if you lose some of them. This is the advantage of the quantity over quality method when you're battling an entrenched spellcaster. But another thing you can do to potentially gain an advantage over someone with incredible arcane power is to put duress on the human or /mortal weaknesses, right? Again, if you have a wizard, they're still mortal. They still have weaknesses in the physiology that we can exploit. One of them starts with the eye. Again, a wizard is only able to sort of utilize the magic against targets they can see or perhaps even envision, but in order for them to do that on a battlefield, they have to be able to take in a lot of visual stimuli all at once. It's entirely possible to overwhelm the visual nerve, the optic nerve, with a number of different sensory responses and sensory stimulus all at once. This is a potential weakness that we can exploit. Bright or flashing lights, changes in levels of illumination are 2 ways that you can in fact take advantage or hijack the way that the occipital nerve works in order to get a reaction out of a wizard, and that reaction, that fraction of a second, might be the difference between winning a battle and losing everything when you're fighting against someone with arcane power. Similarly, the smell is a huge, important sense that we often take into account, and smells can do a bunch of things. They can trigger positive mental responses, right? If we're exposed to a smell that we have a positive association with, or in some cases, obviously cause people to retch and just double over from discomfort if you're faced with really, really horrific smells. Again, gross smells, garbage, rotting flesh, but great smells also have a pronounced effect on the mortal with a sense of smell. And lastly, let's not forget about hearing. Again, these senses, like hearing, are a part of how you can disorient and distract a wizard, and a disoriented wizard is a dead wizard. Again, you can use things like high-pitched noises, very loud noises in close quarters, or something that's really important is that you can overwhelm the auditory stimulus in someone's brain if you use a ton of different sounds at high volumes all at the same time or in rapid succession. It's another way that you can potentially sort of disorient or trick someone by, again, essentially hijacking their senses and using them against them. And there's really no better way to do this than with an ambush. Now, traditional ambushes have a lot going on, but I think if we can take advantage of the human senses or the mortal senses, we can get even greater use out of the ambush and, thusly, have an even more effective time combating the wizard. So one of the ways that you can do this is to pull focus and distract. In this example, what I've drawn up as a sort of tactical roadmap, those like big red fire looking things are big red fires, essentially bonfires set up by non-combatants that we have placed on one side of the path, and then they run away immediately. They are designed to be large, to be bright, and to be kind of loud, or at least as loud as they can be. Pour as much lantern oil onto the wood as you possibly can, set it all up, and then we'll worry about what happens to the forest later. We have a wizard to neutralize. Those yellow dots are, again, part of the guards that would be with a wizard. As with most important military assets, it's unlikely a wizard would be traveling during wartime by themselves, and that's, I think, very important. Those blue circles represent our soldiers. In this instance, once the blazes are lit, they will naturally pull focus. The human eye is drawn to bright light and bright things, especially when it has been not exposed to those bright things instantly. When that happens, we're going to focus on concentric cones of fire. In this instance, those triangles emanating from those centers are trying to catch the wizard in between them. This is where you would use a high rate of fire weapon, like a sling, something that you could get a ton of shots off in a very quick, rapid amount of time. In some cases, even faster than a bow and arrow. The reason we're using a high rate of fire weapon at range is you want to try to overwhelm and overstimulate the wizard's sense of sight. The real threat to the wizard doesn't come from the fire or from the slings that you're trying to do to overload the visuals. What happens are our two snipers, as indicated by those blue arrows. They are the people trying to take the wizard out while they are distracted with all of the visual stimulus. Again, this ambush is not designed to take out this patrol. The ambush is designed to take the wizard out and then run the heck away immediately so that we can learn to fight another day. You can also use sound as a potential for an ambush. Again, one of the things that I mentioned is that a lot of loud noises all at once can in many cases disorient someone, force them to look around. Their brain is not sure what to do with the information that it just processed from the ears, and they're not sure where to look to next. In order to use this, there's a couple different things you could do. This is like a kitchen ambush. But again, let's say that we've got a chance to get rid of this wizard. We've isolated them in a location, and we have half a shot. Those yellow lines on the table that kind of look like eyes, lowercase eyes, are in fact trick candles, which were real things that existed. They would put like small amounts of gunpowder, or in some cases small amounts of chemicals, at different points in the wick, so that when the wick reached that chemical, it would make a popping noise. Imagine all of those going off all at once. That could potentially distract them. That little hanging triangle represents some hanging pots and pans that our assailant is going to cut down, and that yellow looking Pac-Man, a very sad looking Pac-Man in one corner, is kind of a stove. I envision us putting something that will react really poorly when it's heated up in that stove. Again, this is all medieval tech that we can use, but imagine all of a sudden you're in an enclosed space, those candles start popping, there's a loud thing falling, the stove starts going, you're not sure where to go or where to look, and that's at the point that all three of our assailants close at the same time. Again, you want the wizard to be disoriented. They're not sure where to pull focus to first. Any time that you can get the wizard to be disoriented is a tactical advantage for you and your soldiers. So when would you use techniques like this? Well, there's a couple things that you would want to have. One, you need to have time to prep. These ambushes take time and coordination, and if you know where the wizard is going to be, goes back to the importance of intelligence, but if you know where the wizard is going to be, you can prepare for the wizard accordingly. You know you can get them alone, or at the very least, more isolated than possible. Taking a powerful wizard on when they're surrounded by the rest of their army is a recipe for disaster, and you know that you can get close. I didn't add it here, but all of this, the importance of isolating the wizard means that you're probably behind enemy lines, the importance of time to prep and how to prep, and the ability to get close also indicates that this is a method that you would use when you have elite soldiers and strike forces capable of taking on a complex mission like this one. But what about good old-fashioned skullduggery, right? Remember, these beings are still mortal. This means that we can still manipulate the things that hurt mortal beings to our advantage. And how do we do that? Well, how about just good old-fashioned assassins? Again, one of the things that you can do is if you've got one or two capable or perhaps desperate individuals, you can send them behind enemy lines with the express purpose of trying to infiltrate an enemy encampment and just get rid of the wizard before the wizard is in play. The wizard still needs to sleep or rest or at least take a break, and that's a good time for you to take out the vulnerable wizard. Again, you could also poison their water supply. If the wizard can't drink anything but non-contaminated, non-bacteria-ridden liquid, they're probably hosed. It's very hard to shoot fireballs when you're shooting fiery liquid out of both ends because you have dysentery or some other foodborne bacteria-ridden illness because you drank corrupted water. And on that note, why not poison the food as well? Again, the wizard needs to eat, the wizard needs to drink, and at some point, if you can catch the wizard lacking in the streets, you can make sure that they're not going to be a problem. Sometimes you can't beat someone on the battlefield. Sometimes you have to beat them with good old-fashioned cheating. So you would use this strategy when you're either know that you're behind on troops, you can't sacrifice or attempt to sacrifice a lot of people to take the wizard on the battlefield, you know you can get behind enemy lines, or you're either really desperate or really hidden. If you're really desperate, you are going to take these measures because you have nothing else. You have exhausted all of the other options or opportunities, or potentially most of the opportunities to take care of the wizard in ways that you were capable. Or you are so well hidden and ingratiated into the area that the wizard inhabits that you are confident you can pull one of these techniques off in a way that will render the wizard ineffective before the battle even begins. And that is when you would employ this. And again, it says a lot for you taking your shot, which leads me to a tech advantage. Taking a shot is a huge deal when you're battling against the wizards, and likely a presence of magic in any world would trigger a greater level of technological development as human beings attempted to either harness magic or create tools that would give the average person or above average person an advantage when facing a caster. Something like this spear handle, which was developed to allow Cro-Magnon man and the prehistoric man to actually throw spears faster and effectively, is a good example of something that you would maybe use if you're taking on a Neolithic spellcaster of some kind. It's likely that arrows or ranged combat weapons of some kind would be utilized as well, and mass fire is a very effective way to, again, engage a wizard. You want to try to overwhelm their visual stimuli. It's a good way to do it. The crossbow is a weapon that is so effective, so useful, and so brutal that, again, the Vatican tried to ban it during the Middle Ages because it was that effective at getting rid of knights. It's a huge deal. I love a weapon I can point, shoot, and unalive a giant armored titan of a man, despite the fact that I, a humble turnip farmer, do not have any of the military training. That's pretty great. Go turnip farmers. However, there is one very important method that you can do. It's the Warhammer method. Just shoot the dude. Warhammer, despite being what I would consider not a low fantasy setting, pause for a second, pause your outrage. Warhammer, the role-playing game, is a low fantasy setting because your GM can usually control the amount of fantasy you interact with. Warhammer, the old world, or as I like to just call it, plain old Warhammer Fantasy, is definitely not low fantasy because in those games you are usually duking it out with, I don't know, actual astral demigods or the avatars of literal deities that have come into the material plane or demonic princes that have burst from the lairs of hell to go and crusade or, I don't know, arcane-powered Aztec lizardmen who were left behind by the old gods in an attempt to terraform the planet. That's not low fantasy to me, dog. That's not a dig against Warhammer, by the way. Warhammer's great, but just, Warhammer Battle is very different than Warhammer, the role-playing game, IMO. In any case, the solution of just shoot the dude is a great strategy, right? It's really hard for a wizard to block something or counter something that they cannot get rid of or cannot see because it's hurtling toward them at 1500 meters per second and is also on fire and will explode if the wizard touches it wrong. That's really useful if we are going to beat the wizard. Weapons like the arquebus or the cannon or the matchlock rifle, depending on what technological era your role-playing game is set in, are going to be incredibly effective because A, they're hard to dodge, B, they're absolutely devastating, and C, they actually go to our first point, you can overwhelm them because it doesn't take a ton of training to teach people to use muskets in the same way it probably takes a ton of training to become a competent spellcaster. And if there's a single show or media property that does this best or showcases this best, it is the show Fate Stay Night. Fate Stay Night is an anime, for those of you who don't know, that is centered around a Hunger Games-esque style battle royale where wizards summon the spirits of heroic legends and they fight over the Holy Grail, which will give them one wish that can alter reality. Yes, that is the greatest premise ever. At one point, slight spoiler, the ghost of Lancelot is summoned and he Green Goblin surfs on 2 F-15 fighter jets while he uses a cursed sword to shoot missiles back at other wizards. It's so cool. But in any case, in the most recent version of Fate, they send delegations, or the competition has gone global for the first time, and so there is an American delegation, and the Japanese wizards send wizards to America, according to the lore in this world, a place where wizards are traditionally far weaker, and they realize that the Japanese have been found out, and that this guy holding the lighter is signaling an ambush of the Japanese mage by American wizards, or by the American Wizarding Association. And the way that they handle this is the single most American thing ever. So, real quick, content warning everybody for flashing lights, violence, and blood. If you want to skip that, go to the timestamp. Okay? Okay, if it sounds like I'm smiling a lot, because this is amazing. So, alright. Are they gone? Yep, I am a legitimate scholar. All of this is to say that the development of firearms in any way, shape, or form, or any weapon that could give you a technological advantage, would be and should be considered to be a useful skill against the wizard. Also, scraw. But now that we've settled down just a little bit, I think it's time to address some interesting things, some world building, so to speak, or at least some ideas to get your creative juices flowing about how the use of magic in the real world would impact certain things that developed. I think one of the biggest things that we could potentially talk about are cities and structures. It's interesting to consider that in a world where magic on the battlefield could exist, and any living human could be a walking siege engine, maybe it's possible that towns don't develop in quite the same way. Although I do think that stone fortifications are still an excellent selection, because they block line of sight, they're hard to destroy even with magic or like siege engines, so yeah, I think that stuff would still happen. However, I think if magic is in play, it would not be weird to consider the idea that medieval towns or ancient cities would erect wizard towers and have wizards on standby to act as, I don't know, an ancient or medieval version of a missile defense system, something that could block oncoming magic attacks from destroying them. And assuming that maybe a country doesn't have wizards or doesn't have the access to them, it's not entirely implausible to think that there would be outriders or military groups patrolling far outside the city on its borders and apprehending people before they entered the city, just to see if they are magical, because although an outrider patrol probably wouldn't be able to take down an individual wizard, especially if they know that the wizard isn't a wizard before like they start casting spells, it is a good first warning system that a wizard or a spellcaster is coming or nearby. I think that's important to consider, and I think it would make for a very interesting and intriguing way to develop city defenses. Or the city may not develop at all. What if instead, because of the threat to an established area or established city, maybe, just maybe, people decide to take it on the road in large caravans and use those as a way of a quote-unquote city or town, because constantly being on the move, meaning that you can't be found by powerful spellcasters or armies that wield powerful spellcasters, is another potential way that a civilization could develop as an active response to magical powers being a thing. I think that would be a really interesting angle to consider when you're planning your game world or your military tactics. I also want us to consider that maybe, just maybe, military would develop at a very different pace and a very different rate. I think the best way to look at this is to observe the unit, the Spanish Tercio, which was particularly common during those early ages of westward expansion. The Tercio combined two different, very disparate types of groups: the pikemen, which had started to fall out of favor during the Middle Ages, and the actual arquebus, the real arquebus. And by pikemen, I mean like almost like an honest-to-God phalanx style of pikemen, not like the Skiltron pikemen, which would have been used in the Middle Ages, obviously. But the Tercio develops as a result of the need to have guns in the battlefield, but on the weakness of a rifleman, an arquebus man, to be able to set up and take those shots. You know, you don't want to just leave them out in a line somewhere on the battlefield where they can get run down. You want them to be able to move around, but you also want them to move around protected. And as a result of that, the Tercio comes to be. The pikemen protect the arquebus wielders, the musketeers. I think an arquebuser, I forget what the exact name is for that. But anyway, the men using the arquebus would in turn protect the pikemen. The Spanish Tercio dominates a lot of warfare in Europe for a pretty decent chunk of time, until other people eventually figure out, oh, hey, we can do a similar system, and things grow and develop. Again, if you watched our original video on low fantasy warfare, you know that warfare and the development of tactics are all about call and response. A problem is given, that's the call, and then a tactic is developed in response to that, the response. I think something very similar to the Tercio would happen as a result of spellcasters being in the army. You would probably have specialized infantry or even cavalry that were designed to protect and offer support to a spellcaster, and then thus the spellcaster could move around the battlefield without being, worried about getting unalived ruthlessly. And in return, the spellcaster probably is able to help protect and fight along with said military unit. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Speaking of cavalry too, this is a picture of the winged hussars from Poland. A lot of people take into account that the winged hussars are developed essentially as a response to the Tercio or units like the Tercio, and so the lances the winged hussars of Poland use aren't thick, they're hollow. Actually, I don't know what the opposite of not being hollow is, but they're hollow, right? They're far longer, so they can outreach your standard pike, and thus potentially get to the arquebuser and the pikemen before they get a shot off or get to stab you. And they're hollow, meaning that they're lighter, so that your arm can support how long the lance is, much like the Polish winged hussar develops as a result of those infantry tactics. I think a similar style cavalry unit would probably develop, one that uses magical tactics and magical spells as a result of having to adapt to wizards and infantry units using wizards. Again, it's interesting for us to consider, and I think it's a cool angle if you're a game master, to really think about how your world's societies and civilizations, how their militaries will develop as an active response to the magic that is being wielded both by them and against them. It's a very important consideration to make. And lastly, I think you also need to think about how magic would change. One of the things that I think we, as people, take for granted if we don't pay attention to history is that a lot of things that start as military technology wind up becoming modern conveniences, and that the eventual through line of military tech to modern convenience to technological thing that gets developed and helps to push human growth even further is essentially a very potent cycle, one that I think develops exponentially. So it's not entirely implausible to think about the idea that once they're on the battlefield, wizards and magic in general starts to be used for things other than combat, right? You could potentially use it to help seal and keep food fresh. One of the big issues in the Middle Ages and antiquity is rotting food or bacteria-ridden food, and magic offers a number of potential answers to those problems. Or what about things like numismatics or banking, things like accounting, or just cataloging the known knowledge of the world? It's entirely possible that magic makes the greater growth of knowledge in a medieval setting much, much greater, and through that greater growth, we tend to find a better utopia. How about sports? Like the idea of wizards in sports, and yes, I did use the NBA Wizards logo, stop me if you can, but like sports would also probably grow to develop and include magic and magical elements, right? People like to be entertained. If you watched the first ever low fantasy video we did, people in the Middle Ages looked for entertainment any way they could get it. There is no freaking way that they would have access to magic and not turn it into a competitive game. Imagine like dragons v mech suits. Come on, that sounds so cool. Imagine a big, giant, enchanted medieval Gundams with catapult arms fighting dragons for the entertainment of everybody. The tournament would be sweet, dude. I want like a little magic crystal that does the Travis Scott sound effect where it goes, "It's lit!" As like, people are fighting. It sounds awesome. Eventually, though, it's not entirely implausible to think that maybe, just maybe, the low fantasy magic over periods of hundreds and hundreds of years has the potential to transform a low fantasy world into a high fantasy one that is kind of like a utopia. I think it's a huge deal, and I think it's something to really consider. All of this, however, goes into the greater thoughts of magic in warfare. Men, one of the things that you have to think about, especially me as a historian, is that the innovations that start on the battlefield usually wind up transforming life off of the battlefield. But as always, now it is time to talk about how to include these in our games. And I've got a couple interesting ideas for ways that you can incorporate some of the tactics and strategies other than the literal tactics and strategies that we've talked about in the video. One of those things I think you should include is the development or co-development of spellcasters alongside their military components. And I think the way that you do that is I would call these unit pair-up abilities. So for example, a military unit like the soldiers alongside a wizard might be able to channel elemental energy into their weapons. They might have limited flight, increased durability. They might be able to draw on some modicum of that wizard's arcane spellcasting in order to make themselves more powerful on the battlefield. In a similar way, the wizard could choose to use the health or armor of the warriors next to them instead of their own when it comes to tanking literal damage. You want to create some sort of symbiotic bond between wizard and warrior, and I think that's a pretty cool way to do it. Another one that I want to talk about is the natural development of how town defenses might come to be, and realistically, if there's arcane ability in the world, there's got to be some way to turn that into a defensive structure. And ballista towers make for a great way of doing this. I think it's entirely possible that in places where wizards are prevalent, even in a low fantasy world, there would be some pains taken to making anti-magic homing weapons, things that are not only capable of tracking and tracing shots to people with actual wizarding ability, but also, being able to pierce any arcane defenses a low fantasy wizard might have ready. But I also think that one of the things you can do is lean into the skullduggery angle and the way that technology and tactics would develop as a result of this, and the wizard apothecary makes a ton of sense. But specifically, the idea that maybe, just maybe, you would turn to the natural law and science in order to develop weapons or techniques that are able to deal massive damage, or at the very least deal very harshly with the arcane wizard in general. It's entirely plausible, I think, that groups of professionals in a world where low fantasy runs rampant would probably work to cultivate something that would be effective as a poison, or at the very least as a chemical deterrent to the wizards around them. So, the question you might be asking yourself is, what's next? And the answer to that is very simple. You may have noticed that I left a lot of really famous wizards, like Gandalf, for example. Or, although I referenced the show, I don't really talk about Freeren all that much. And that's because those are high fantasy wizards. This video is already exorbitantly long, and it is so without the use of a Q&A. So I'm not gonna lie to you guys, a high fantasy wizard video is a totally separate beast. If you want to see how I would essentially destroy a demigod, 1,000 likes I think is fair. And if you don't get 1,000 likes, you know what? I'm just happy that we got to do this. This was absolutely amazing. But 1,000 likes, and I will tell you how to slay Gandalf. And with that, I have to say thank you to a couple people. But first, if you like this, join the Patreon. $10 a month, you get a unique role-playing game you can't get anywhere else. If you want our games, including the newly released A Fear Within, you can get that by following the QR code to our itch.io page. If you want physical copies of any of our stuff, Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral are how you get it. And a massive thank you to Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Solution, Alex.vksh, Papa Dinosaur, and our newest patron, Chromatic Orbital Strike. Thank you, folks, so much for helping us get this done. It means the absolute world to me. And actually, I get to say thank you in person. Well, kind of. Hello, everybody. It's me. Hi, it's the Dork. Thank you, by the way, for this. A couple of things. One, usually this is the section where the Q&A section would go in the video. That has actually been moved to the Patreon page. The YouTube keeps spiking our algorithm because the watch rate drops off when the Q&A happens. So you don't have to be a Patreon member to watch it. You don't even have to be a free one. I don't even want your Gmail. If you like that section, I didn't want to gatekeep it. It is at the Patreon page, but it is a public post, so anybody can watch it. Two, you may have noticed a couple times I was talking about some changes happening to the channel and some things that were going on with me. I was heavily considering stopping making videos, which is, I don't know why I said that with such a big smile. But yeah, I have recently felt really deeply dissatisfied with the type of content that I make, with the games that I have been working on, and yeah, it's been kind of hard to shake, realistically. I don't know if that's a caveat or a question of like just too much work, or actually no, that's not true at all. It's not the work. There have been some changes in my personal community that have made it really hard to play games recently, and as much as I like the videos that we have been putting out, there have been some really good ones. I feel like I can always do better, and working on the low fantasy video and this one have really kind of reinvigorated me. But more than that, you guys have reinvigorated me. I can't tell you the number of really nice comments that I got, or Instagram DMs, or like emails where people were like, hey man, like I really am inspired by the stuff that you make, and it's making me want to make stuff, and you guys are sending me rules, or you're doing stuff at the Desks of Dorks Game Jam, or you're just shooting me some good vibes. And I didn't tell you that I was having this problem. I was just kind of thugging it out, and you guys sort of came through in a really big way. So I'm not going anywhere. This video is stupid long, but yeah, I just want to say thank you, and I felt like this is a thank you that you should see my face for. So thank you to everybody. So yeah, in that case, y'all are great. Thank you again for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Thanks for doing the Patreon, doing all the stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh, I'm Kyle Ott for Desks of Dorks. You've been absolutely amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.